All right, kids. Today I'm going to read you chapters 24, 25, and 26 of Escape from Warsaw. Let's review the summaries of chapter 21, 22, and 23. In chapter 21, the Burgermeister came to the farm. He talked to the farmer first, and then they invited Eddick in. The Burgermeister told Eddick that the kids would be being sent back to Poland with all the other Polish and Ukrainian refugees. He said he was being a friend by coming by a day before to let him know what was happening, but that he would be there the next day to collect them and send them back. In chapter 22, the farmer has spent some time thinking of a plan for the kids to be able to escape and not be sent back by the Burgermeister. He finally settled on the kids traveling downriver, and so he had those canoes that had belonged to his sons in the attic of his house. He got them out, showed the kids how to use them, told them the plan of going down the river and how that smaller river connected into the larger Danube, which, remember, you labeled the Danube river on that social studies map. Yeah, the farmer provided the kids with a way to escape. Now, remember, after they set off, Jan wondered where Ludwig was. Mrs. Frau, whatever her name was, I can't remember at the moment, said he was in the woods. But it turned out he wasn't really in the woods. He was hiding in Jan's boat. So Jan has left and Ludwig is with him. That's going to be important later on. Okay, chapter 3. Ruth and Branya were in one canoe. Jan and Eddick and Ludwig are in another canoe. They've gotten separated from each other because Ruth's canoe got hung up on the bridge and the soldier saw them. He jumped down into the water and he tried to get them. Okay, he tried to catch them. They ended up getting away. They had some adventures on the river, like getting caught in the rapids, but later they were able to meet up again with the boys at the end of the smaller river right before it emptied into the larger Danube at the city of Falkenberg. Okay? And wow, I misspelled American there. I'll have to go back and fix that. They didn't notice that the convoy of American trucks passing by with all the Polish refugees on it. I hope the convoy didn't notice them. All right, chapter 24, Missing. They walked into Falkenberg, crossed the Danube, then got a lorry lift for some miles along the road to Switzerland. After this, more walking. 3 days later, tired and joyful, they camped by the roadside. "Only 80 miles more to Lake Constance," said Ruth gaily, as she looked for a patch of dry grass for Branya to lie in. "Is Lake Constance in Switzerland?" said Branya. "Switzerland is on the far shore of the lake," said Ruth. "Lie down here, Branya. The grass is nice and thick." "Will Mother be waiting for us on the shore?" said Branya. "Perhaps she will," said Ruth, and in the dim light nobody noticed that her eyes were wet with tears. Jan's treasure box was one of the few things which they had salvaged from the wrecked canoes. He had been too busy to think about it, but tonight he decided to open it to make sure that all his treasures were safe. With Ludwig's nose in his lap, he took the lid off the box and counted them one by one. Suddenly he leapt to his feet. "The sword is missing," he said. "Somebody's stolen it." "Nobody would do that," said Ruth. "Let me have a look." She checked through the box, but the sword wasn't there. Thinking carefully back to the last time she had seen it, she said, "You showed it to Mr. and Mrs. Wolf, Jan, and put it on the mantelpiece beside Rudolph's photo. Did you leave it there?" For a moment, Jan stopped his raging, then grunted, Yes, and ran off to the roadside. Ruth said no more. Branya lay curled in the grass with a blanket over her, already half asleep. Ruth gave her attention to Edic. Since the river adventure he had been coughing more than ever, and had complained more than once that the pain in his chest was getting worse. She was shocked to see how ill and haggard he looked. Haggard means tired. In her knapsack she had a jersey that Mrs. Wolf had given her. That's a sweater. She made him put it on and lie down on his blanket. Soon he stopped coughing and lay still. "Where's Jan gone?" he asked. Ruth looked up. It was almost dark now, and Jan was nowhere to be seen, nor was Ludwig. She stood up and called him. From way up the road a voice called back, "I'm going back for the sword." "The silly little idiot," Ruth exploded, and she ran off after him. A few minutes later she brought him back. She told him off roundly, pointing out that the wolves were honest folk and would look after the sword until it was sent for. Sullen, resentful, plunged in gloom, he said nothing at first, but when Ruth lay down to sleep he muttered, "I'm going back all the same." "Light a fire for us, Jan," said Ruth. "Edic's not well, and it will help him to sleep." It was a warm night, and they did not need a fire, but she felt sure that Jan would not leave them once he had put his mind to something practical. Nevertheless, when the fire was burning and the other three were sleeping, she forced herself to keep awake just in case. At midnight the fire had died down to a red glow. She was still awake. Out of the darkness and the stillness a voice spoke, or rather gasped, her name. "Edic, I thought you were asleep," she said. "I can't sleep. The pain's too bad," said Edic. I can't go any farther." "You'll feel better in the morning," said Ruth. "Can't walk any more," said Edic. "We'll get a lift. It's only 80 miles. "There's no traffic going that way," said Edic. She talked to him quietly for a while, and after another bout of coughing, he dropped off to sleep. But anxiety for him kept her awake. A change had come over him during the last 24 hours. If they did not reach Switzerland soon, he might not live. The hours crept on, and still she did not sleep. Once more, out of the stillness, a voice called her name. This time it was Jan. "Ruth, may I have Edic's shoes when he dies?" he said. "He's not going to die," said Ruth, forcing herself to speak calmly. "He will if I don't have my sword," said Jan. "And we'll never find your father either. He gave me the sword, and it's our guide and lifeline. We can't do without it." He spoke with such certainty that she almost believed him. It was true that while they had the sword, fortune had been kind to them, and now Edic was more gravely ill than he had ever been. But all she said was, "Go to sleep, Jan. Everything will be all right." Jan did not go to sleep. It was Ruth who slept. There came a time toward dawn when she could not keep her eyes open any longer. The fire was cold, and the sun was peering over the rim of the hills when she woke. Jan and Ludwig were gone. A crumpled blanket and a half-moon of flattened grass showed where they had lain. Her first thought was to run after Jan. Then a glance at the two sleepers reminded her that she had other responsibilities more pressing. Gently she touched Edic's hand. It had hardly any warmth in it. His face was frighteningly pale. Giving way to panic, she leaned over to listen for his breathing. Yes, he was breathing. Thank God for that. But he did not look as if he would be able to get up, let alone walk. The road was empty, and there was nobody in sight. Her strong faith seemed to desert her, and she felt more dreadfully alone than ever. Was it true what Jan had said about the sword? With a fierce effort of will, she took herself in hand and began to prepare breakfast. There was still food in the knapsack left over from what Mrs. Wolf had given her. Branya was the first awake, and she ate hungrily. She did not seem at all worried to find Jan and Ludwig gone. "Jan can look after himself," she said cheerfully. "He forgets that we may need him to look after us," said Ruth. The sun stealing over his drawn face woke Edic. He was too dazed to notice that Jan and Ludwig were missing. Ruth could not persuade him to eat anything. "What's wrong with Edic? His eyes are all glassy," said Branya. "I expect it's the heat," said Ruth, and Branya was satisfied with the answer. Though it was still early, the sun was already hot. Yet another scorching day was in store for them. Ruth had almost to lift Edic to his feet. When she let go of him, he fell over. With Branya's help, she got him up again, and with their arms round him, they staggered along to the roadside. Edic seemed just sensible enough to understand that he was expected to walk, and after a few paces, he managed fairly well with just Ruth to steady him. But he looked as if he were sleepwalking, and it was only a matter of time before he must collapse. "Shall we have a ride today?" said Branya. "Of course we shall," said Ruth. "The driver said yesterday that there was no traffic on this road going to Switzerland," said Branya. "He was wrong," said Ruth. "Look, there's something coming now." But it was only a laborer on a bicycle, who hardly gave them a glance as he passed by. "I should have asked him for help," thought Ruth, when after an hour of painful walking nobody else had appeared. Then Edic collapsed. There were beads of sweat on his forehead, and he kept muttering, "I can't go on, I can't go on." Ruth dragged him into the shade and told Branya to stay by the roadside and stop the first person that passed. A woman in slacks, that's pants, a woman in slacks came by, pushing a barrow. She seemed to be looking for firewood. Ruth made her understand that they wanted help, but she shrugged her shoulders and made off. A little later, a lorry with a tarpaulin roof stretched over a frame came along. At Branya's signal, it braked to a halt. She called to the driver in Polish. He was an American GI. His face lit up when he heard her speak, and to her astonishment, he answered her in her own language. He stepped down from the truck, lighting a cigarette as he did so. "Have you come from Poland too?" said Branya, forgetting her errand for the moment. "Not exactly. My parents were Polish, but I'm from the States myself," said the man. "We went there before the war. Joe Wolski's my name. Just call me Joe. It's good to hear a Polish voice again." He bent down and took her hands in his. "Now, lady, what's your trouble?" Chapter 25, Joe Wolski. They squashed into the front seat of the truck beside Joe Wolski, and off they rattled on the road to Switzerland. "You'll be telling me next that you've come all the way from Warsaw," said Joe. "So we have," said Branya. "Gee, that's some way," said Joe. "I guess the city's changed since I was there before the war." Pardon me. Pardon me. "I guess the city's changed since I was there before the war. I was only 6 when Ma and Pa took me to the States to settle. I like it a lot over there now, and I can't say I'm sorry we made the move. How's the kid doing?" The kid, Edic, was sitting by the door, where the fresh air from the open window had already revived him. "Would he like a cigarette?" said Joe. Edic shook his head. "What about you, lady?" Ruth refused as well, and she watched Joe take both hands off the steering wheel to light a cigarette for himself, and suddenly jab in an elbow to correct a swerve. After her almost sleepless night, she was too tired to do anything but lie back with her head against the top of the seat. In spite of their good luck in securing a lift, she could not shake off her anxiety for Edic. The countryside swept by, trees and hills and villages, and after a while Ruth roused herself from her sadness and asked Joe where he was taking them. "You leave that to me, lady," he said. "You've plenty on your mind, and you've told me where you want to go." "But we hardly know who you are or what you're doing." "I'm the occupation," he said. "The army taught me French so I could go to Paris, then posted me to Germany because I can't speak German. I'm here to fire folks with the spirit of occupation, to tell them they've all grown up the wrong way. But what's the use? They're so sick and tired, they just stare at you. It's not often you get a chance to actually help someone." Gee, that was a close shave. Joe had been trying to light another cigarette, and the lorry had swerved across the road, skidded, and nearly knocked down a tree. He righted her just in time, blew the tree a kiss, and drove on. "What was that noise?" said Branya. "I thought I heard a yelp. You haven't run over—" No, said Joe. "Just the tires complaining, I expect. You get used to it. Now, talking about growing up wrong, that tree's a case in point. Only a muttonhead would have let it grow there." "Nonsense," said Ruth. "It was well off the road. Be sensible and let me hold the wheel while you light up." After a while, Branya asked, "What's in the back of the truck, Joe?" "Never you mind," said Joe. "Could I sit in the back?" said Branya. "You wouldn't like it," said Joe. "There's a couple of bears and a hyena in there." "Jan would love that," said Branya. "Who's Jan? Is he your boyfriend?" said Joe. Branya giggled and told him he was a friend who had run away. "Oh," said Joe, and a suspicion of a smile stole across his face. "Why did he run away?" Branya told him all about it, and when she had finished, Joe said, "I once knew a kid who ran away like Jan. I had gone to sleep in the back of my truck, alone, mark you, and when I woke in the morning, there he was, stretched out beside me. Must have climbed in over the tailboard during the night. I shook him awake and asked him what the heck he was doing. Said he was going north, and if I was going that way, would I take him to— I forget the name of the village, some place north of the Danube. Now I was going north, as it happened, but when I heard his business, I changed my mind. I told him he ought to have known better than to desert his folks. He kicked and stormed at me as if he were crazy, and called me all the names that aren't in the dictionary. Know what to do with a fellow like that? You truss him up and leave him to cool off in the back of the truck till he knows better. And that's just what I did." There was a question already on Branya's lips when she heard a bark from behind her. "That must be the hyena," said Joe. "Like to take a look?" He stopped the truck by the side of the road, and Ruth and Branya followed him out and round the back. He hoisted them up into the hyena's cage. There on the floor in front of a pile of crates was Ludwig, barking and wagging his tail, and Jan beside him, with a handkerchief over his mouth and his wrists and ankles bound. Joe undid his bonds and said with a broad grin, "How you feeling, kid?" Jan's answer was to kick out at Joe and spit at him like a Catherine wheel, while the elderly and good-natured Ludwig crouched in a corner growling, but not quite knowing what to make of it all. "It was true what I told you about a couple of bears and a hyena," said Joe. "Here they are, all rolled into one." Ruth begged Jan to stop kicking, but he took no notice. "Does this make you feel better?" said Joe, and he threw him a slab of chocolate. Jan threw it back again. "Nothing for it but to tie up the parcels again," said Joe, and as Jan would not listen to Ruth's reasoning, he had to carry out the threat. He managed with some difficulty to tie Jan to the tailboard in such a way that he could not throw himself out, but left his ankles unbound and his mouth free. And off they went. The lorry made quite a lot of noise on the bumpy road, but not half as much as Jan made. In this manner they journeyed the 60-odd miles to Lake Constance, right to the gate of the Red Cross camp where Joe had planned to take them. It was a collection of tents and Nissan huts between Oberlurgen and Meersburg, within a stone's throw of the lake. The hills round were thickly wooded, and trees crowded the shore. Through a gap in the trees across the water could be seen the green hills of Switzerland, and behind them, in a haze of sunshine, the majestic Alps. Ruth gasped. The mountains were more beautiful than anything she had ever imagined. They looked so near that she could almost lean over and touch them. The motion of the truck had rocked Edic to sleep, and he only stirred when Ruth and Branya shouted and clapped for joy. "Please, can you let Jan out?" said Ruth. "He'll feel quite different if you show him the mountains of Switzerland." Joe untied him. Jan was quiet and sober, for he had kicked and shouted till he had no more kick or shout in him. He accepted some chocolate, and when Joe put an arm round his shoulders and pointed to the mountains they had come so far to see, he burst into tears. Chapter 26. News at last. Joe did not find it easy to persuade the camp to take in the family. It was not at the moment overcrowded. In fact, a whole party of refugees had recently been sent back to their countries, but it was in a muddle. The decision to make this corner of South Germany part of the French zone had only been taken in the middle of June. Now it was August, and the Americans were beginning to hand over to the French. The muddle helped Joe to get his way. It also helped Ruth to get hers. The camp doctor wanted to separate the family, with Edic in the Nissan hut, which served for a hospital, and the rest in E Block at the other end of the camp. Ruth refused to leave him. Finally, she was allowed one of the tents outside the hospital block, within call of Edic's bed, and here, under canvas, the three of them made their home. There was one matter in which the camp superintendent refused to budge. He would not allow the family to cross over into Switzerland. The Swiss authorities could take no more refugees unless there were relatives in the country willing to be responsible for them. Besides this, they needed some definite proof of identity before any arrangements could be started upon. Ruth thought that the sword might help to prove who they were, and she wrote at once to the farmer for this. As for relatives in Switzerland, she did not even know if her father had ever arrived there, nor could she remember her grandparents' address in Basel. She had no idea if they were even still alive. She was feeling sad and disheartened when she said goodbye to Joe. They had come so far, and now that their goal was within sight, it seemed harder than ever to reach. She thanked him from the bottom of her heart for all of his kindness. "Don't call me kind," said Joe. "Everywhere's a mess, wherever you look. I want to help clean it up. I want to show folks that you can't see all of life from a hole in a blitzed cellar. There's more to it than ruins and rubble. Sometimes things work out right, and sometimes they don't." As he shook Ruth's hand, he added, "This time they're going to work out right." One by one, the hot, stifling days dragged by. There was thunder in the air, but the black clouds held back their rain. They seemed to be saving it up for some grand and terrible occasion. Had it not been for Edic, who was too ill to be out of bed for more than a few hours each day, the others would have borrowed a small boat and risked the crossing. But Edic's illness kept them back. That and the hope that the ITS, the International Tracing Service, would soon answer the superintendent's letter. He had lost no time in sending them all the information that Ruth had given him. His inquiries in Basel for the grandparents had yielded no results. What was more surprising was that Ruth received no reply from Herr Wolf about the sword. The ITS occupied a huge barracks once used by Nazi stormtroopers. In those early days of so-called peace, the Child Search Branch had hardly got going and was able to deal with inquiries quite quickly. But the index of missing children was growing all the time, as each day brought more and more inquiries. Is my child dead? Our home was bombed while I was serving in Africa, and I believe my younger daughter survived, but I have failed to trace her. My 2 sons were taken from me in Auschwitz in 1942 and adopted by a German family in Nuremberg. Can you, etc., etc. Inquiries like these arrived by every post. One day, late in the month, the superintendent called Ruth to his office. Was it good news or bad? His face was as grave as usual and betrayed nothing. He spoke slowly. That sword you told me about, Ruth, would you describe it to me, please? She did so in great detail, even mentioning a tiny piece on the hilt which was slightly bent. As she described it and launched once again into the story of its adventures, a smile spread over his face. Ruth, you're the luckiest girl in Europe, he said, and he unrolled a small brown paper parcel on his desk. Out of it tumbled 2 crumpled letters and the sword. One letter was from Herr Wolf and the other from her father. Both were addressed not to her, but to the headquarters of the ITS. Herr Wolf's letter contained as much of the story of the family as he had managed to piece together, as well as details of their plans for getting to Switzerland. He had found the sword the very day that they had left and had sent it off at once to the ITS with the letter. Ruth's letter to him, written from the camp, had evidently gone astray, for she had no reply to it till weeks later. The other letter, from her father, Joseph Belitsky, bore a January date. In it he described the children and their circumstances up to the time when he had last seen them. He also referred to his escape from Zakina, his unsuccessful attempt to find his family, the meeting with Jan and how he had given him the sword, and his long journey to Switzerland. And now the miracle had worked. Ruth was so overcome that all she could do was bury her face in her hands. She hardly heard what the superintendent was saying. I received this information 2 days ago, but I didn't want to tell you till I had checked it all. You see, your father's letter is months old, and I had to get in touch with him. He's living in Appenzell, just the other side of the lake. Here's his reply to me. He handed Ruth the telegram, but she was still too dazed to take it all in. He handed Ruth a telegram, but she was still too dazed to take in all that he had said, and he had to repeat most of it again. Brushing away her tears, she read the message. Will collect children on 23rd at Meersburg by the afternoon boat. All arrangements about permits in hand this end. Please wire answer. Will ring Ruth tonight if possible. I wish all our cases could end as happily as yours, said the superintendent. But Ruth was already out of the room and running to her family to tell them the great tidings. 5 minutes later, the Red Cross nurse on duty in E Block heard a fearful row. Rushing into the last Nissan hut, she found 3 children and an elderly dog dancing up and down on Edic's bed. When she protested, they threw all his pillows at her. So she fetched a broom and chased the 3 of them down to the lake. Then she returned, angry and out of breath, to pick up the pillows and see if the patient had died of shock. But the patient had sneaked out of bed and, by a roundabout way, joined the others on the shore. For him the news was more of a tonic than all the medicine and all the rest and care in the world. Is that the end of the story? The family, as they laughed and danced for joy on the shore, thought it was. They did not know that what was in some ways their most dangerous ordeal still lay ahead. All right, that's the end of this chapter. Woo! The most exciting, nail-biting thing is still to come in the last 3 chapters. So, comment after I post this tomorrow. Write in the comments, and I want y'all to make some predictions about what you think their dangerous ordeal might be, because there were some clues in the chapter. All right,